Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this Cromwell Mark IV British Cruiser Tank Mark 8 A27M, which is a lot of words where just Cromwell would suffice, but that is what it says on the box, in case you can't read. This is a plastic model in 1/48th scale by Tamiya. Well, it's mostly plastic. The kit features a die-cast lower hull, which you can see here in its own special packaging in the bottom of the box. It's securely glued into the box so that it doesn't move around and damage the plastic parts, which is obviously a good thing. It does have some heft to it, which is the point. This is designed to add weight to the kit, and it does that well. It's not something I feel is necessary, but it is integral to the model, so we can't omit it. Of course, there are plastic parts, and those are, unsurprisingly, pretty good. I feel like it's quite reasonable to expect good quality out of a Tamiya kit. All of these parts are neatly moulded, and the detail is nice and crisp. You can see that in the pictures, but I do like to state the obvious anyway. There are mould lines, there are always mould lines, but they're rather minor and won't take much work to remove. And if you're careful in how you clip the parts off the sprue, you shouldn't spend too much time doing cleanup with this kit. The parts, for the most part, fit together very nicely, though I did have a couple of difficulties. You'll see those when we get to them. Detail is quite good. I'm obviously no Cromwell expert, so I wouldn't be able to identify any errors unless they were glaringly obvious, but it looks very good and Cromwell-y to me. It's not a super detailed model and it probably won't get rivet counters excited, but I don't think it's really trying to do those things. Here's something I know will excite everybody else though: polycaps. There are 4 of these in a little baggie. Good stuff. Everybody likes polycaps. There's also this length of stringy, ropey stuff. I'm not sure what this material is. It isn't string or brass wire, obviously, but it's intended for making towing cables, and I suspect it would work rather well for that. A decal sheet is included. They look good and there's a few options here. Tamiya decals do tend to be quite decent, so I can't imagine there being any problems when this tank is eventually painted and it's decal time. The instructions are pretty much what I would expect from a kit like this. They are the fold-out kind rather than a nice booklet, and I know I always complain about that. The important thing, really, is that the instructions are mostly clear and easy to understand. I did have 1 or 2 moments where I wasn't totally sure what I was looking at, but that's probably more of a me problem than one with the instructions, and I got there anyway. There are the usual basic painting and marking guides which are, well, basic, but they can be helpful, so it's nice that they are there. And that's what's in the box. Now let's glue some bits to other bits, starting with the idler wheels. These are nice and easy to put together, and there's keying so each side lines up neatly, and there's obviously one of these for either side. And now, more wheels. Road wheels this time. There are 10 of these, which, like the idler wheels, are each made up of 2 halves. These are very simple to put together. There's no keying, you just slot the parts together. Here's the resulting pile of wheels. They look really good. Drive sprockets come next. These actually have a few more bits than the average drive sprocket. There's a sort of ring thing that goes on the inside of both halves of the sprocket. Then there's a polycap that goes in the center. This will make it so the sprocket will stay in place with friction alone. The 2 halves can then be glued together, which is guided by the keying. Very easy, and obviously there's one of these for either side of the tank as well. Next, it's time to assemble the butt of the Cromwell. First, I glue these side parts, I don't know what to call them, and I'm not sure it matters. They fit quite nicely anyway. Then I add these box things to either side of the towing hitch mount. I think they're smoke candle holders or something like that. These are keyed, but you could probably glue these on upside down if you really wanted to. Turns out, I didn't want to. Then, why not add the towing hitch? This is as easy as it looks, and it does look quite easy. Just make sure that you don't put it on upside down. The rear part of this boxy thing goes into place next. The corners are shaped such that they should easily line up neatly. You'll have to eyeball the vertical positioning yourself though. Nothing too tricky here. And that's the Cromwell's butt. Why not glue that into place now? This obviously goes on the rear of the hull, and because the hull part is metal, plastic cement is just not going to work, so we use superglue for this kind of thing. This goes together very well. It makes sense to follow this with the lower front plate which goes on the front. This is installed pretty much the same way as the rear part, just there's no extra bits glued onto the plastic bit yet. Continuing with the supergluing of plastic bits onto the metal hull, I install the wheels. The idler wheels go at the front, and then the road wheels on the obvious mounting points along the side of the hull. There's a little bit of play in these, so you may have to nudge them so they line up nice and straight, but that's nothing too difficult. The drive sprockets can then be slid into position at the rear of the hull. These don't need to be glued in. In fact, it's better that you don't. The polycap will hold them in place well enough. Leaving them movable means installing the tracks will be a lot easier. And why not install those tracks now? The most sensible way to do this is to start at the drive sprocket. There are 3 small curved track sections that go on here. It probably would have been a bit easier to glue these on with the sprocket removed from the tank, but this is how I did it. It doesn't make that much of a difference, as long as you get the track links around the right way. Once those were on, I attached the sections that will run over to the top of the road wheels. These parts are numbered, and there's a few different ones, so do consult the instructions to determine which part goes where. When I got to the point of installing the tracks from the drive sprocket down to the bottom of the wheels, I noticed the positioning wasn't quite right. This is where the drive sprockets not being glued into place is rather helpful. I was able to rotate the sprocket around just a bit to where everything would sit a bit better. Obviously this can't be done if the glue on the rest of the tracks has set, so this sort of thing has to be done relatively quick. Either that or just get it right the first time, I guess. The rest of the tracks go on pretty easily. I did have to do a little bit of fiddling at the front to get everything to look decent, but nothing too tricky. If you've done link and length tracks before, you know what to expect. I do like link and length tracks. In my opinion, they're better than rubber band tracks, and much less tedious to install than individual links. I think they look pretty good. Now it's time to join the upper and lower hull parts. You can see that there are 2 points for screws to screw into. The problem is that no screws were included with my kit. I suppose you could source screws elsewhere, but that seems like an annoyance, so I'm just not going to use them. I superglue the 2 hull parts together. I would have used glue in addition to the screws anyway, it just means now there's less holding it together, I suppose. What matters is that the hull stays together, and it should do, unless I drop it, I guess. I add a bit of plastic cement in a couple of places for extra bonding because why not? Next, I glue the machine gun into the upper front plate. You can model this so the gun is movable if you're careful with the glue that holds the ring part in place. I wasn't, and I wasn't especially interested in having the gun movable, but it is an option, and those are always good to have. Why not glue that assembly into place now? I can't think of a reason. This more or less drops right into place. A little pressure to minimize gaps, and it's on. Next, I drill a couple of holes into the grille part that goes on the rear box thing. This only needs to be done if you want to install the exhaust cowling part, and we'll see that later. In the meantime, I glue this part on, which I think is an air intake cover, though I'm not sure. You can see that this part is not symmetrical, and it should be installed with the slightly taller edge towards the front. I then install the grille part. This doesn't seem to fit how I think it should. I mean, it does go into place, but there's a gap at the rear that I'm pretty sure shouldn't be there. I'm not sure if this is something I've done. Maybe I glued the rear part of the box on a bit too low or something like that, or maybe it's just a problem with the kit. I guess it could be worse. I can always fill those gaps in later. Next, I add a fire extinguisher here on the left side. This is obviously pretty simple, and I found tweezers to be rather helpful. And then, a shovel. This is also pretty easy to install, though I found the part wasn't quite the right shape. The handle and digging end were making it so the middle connection point was sitting above the hull. Nothing a little bit of pressure couldn't handle though. Moving to the front of the hull, I install the headlamps. These are different for each side, so do be sure to use the correct parts. They're fairly easy to get into place, though there is a little bit of play to them, so you might have to do a bit of nudging to get them to look right. Next, I add the tops of the vision devices for the gunner on the tank's left, and the driver on the right, who gets 2 vision devices. Lucky fella. And then shackles, because why not? There's 2 of these for the lower front plate and 2 for the mounts above those. The odd thing about these is there isn't anything to guide them. Normally with things like this you would find a little nub on the inside and indents on the bracket part to line things up. That's not the case with this model, so you've just got to eyeball it. It's nothing too difficult. I then glue the inner side part to the rear mudguard bit, which is pretty simple. It was less simple to get that assembly into place. This is an area in which I had a bit of difficulty. It just didn't seem to want to sit on the model the way the instructions wanted it to. It was a bit more difficult on the left side than the right, but I was still dissatisfied with both. I mean, it's not that bad, but it's pretty unusual to have a difficult fit in one of these Tamiya kits, which makes it stand out a bit more. Moving on, I install the little sections of side skirt, I guess you would call it. The fit is okay though, because the rear part fits a bit oddly. This was a bit tricky to install. In the end it looks okay though. Stowage boxes come next. There are 3 of these, and all 3 have a small part that needs to be glued into the front, and that's pretty easy. One of them has a side wall part to cover an opening, and the third has an opening but it doesn't need to be covered because that will be right next to the first stowage box. Installing these is very easy, as you might guess. There are guide pins on the hull that link into the holes in the bottom of the boxes. I add a little bit of extra glue around the bottom of these to give a good strong bond. Praise the glue god. Then, behind the 2 boxes on the right side, a fire extinguisher. This is just as easy to install as the first one. I also added shackles to the rear of the hull, and those go on exactly the same as those on the front. Not much to say about these. I then install this hatch on the engine deck. The only reason for this is that one of the screws would be hidden beneath it. Obviously I didn't have screws to use here, but I still have to glue the hatch into place. It's simple enough to do though, so it's not a problem. I then add what I think is an air vent cover to the front of the hull. It should angle downwards towards the front. Apparently this is to stop bullets from getting in. And then, back to the tank's rear. I install the exhaust cowling. This is an optional part, so you can leave it off if you would prefer. But I did drill the holes for it, so I might as well install it. Also, I just think it looks interesting and is, in my opinion, one of the iconic parts of the Cromwell. Next, I add the front mudguards. These were significantly easier to put on than those at the rear. Before the part is bonded into place, I add the side part, and I do this before letting the first part bond so that I can make adjustments to get a better fit if need be. Onto the back of these brackety parts, I glue these things. I'm not sure what they are, maybe little lights or something. What I am sure of though is these are very thin and a bit fiddly to get into place, and it's a miracle they didn't go flying and get lost when I was clipping them from the sprue, but I did get them into place as you can see. I then add the brush guards for the headlamps. These are thin parts and I was a bit worried about breaking them during cleanup. Fortunately, I didn't. They were a bit fiddly to get into place neatly, but not too difficult. The side hatch comes next, and this is made up of 2 parts. Once I got both parts together, I glued it right into place. This is, as you can imagine, very simple, and we end up with a very hatchy looking hatch. The driver's hatch comes next. Like the hatch on the engine deck, this is to cover one of the unoccupied screw holes. The smaller half of this hatch should go towards the center of the tank. Very simple. Next, I add these angled bits to the sides of the engine deck. I believe these might be air intake covers, though I'm obviously no Cromwell surgeon, so they could be something entirely different. What matters though is that these are very easy to install. Just be sure to put the correct part on the right side of the tank. And with that, the hull is completed, and it's now turret time. I start by assembling the gun mantlet-y bit. I slot the machine gun into its place through from the inside, and then I add glue in behind it to make sure it stays right where I want it. Then this, whatever you might call it, goes into place here. Make sure that you put this around the right way, otherwise when we go to install it in the turret, it's not going to fit. I set that aside and then glue the loose half of the muzzle brake onto the rest of the gun. This fits pretty well, though I did have to do a bit of nudging, and it could probably do with a little bit of sanding and maybe some filling afterwards. Then I glue the bottom of the turret onto the top part. This is easy. Obviously you do want to make sure the bottom is the right way up. What I assume are meant to be mounting points for crew figures should protrude down and out the bottom of the turret. I glue the rear wall on, and this is also rather easy, though do be sure you've got the part the right way up. The round hatch thing on it should be slightly more towards the bottom. At this point I realised I had missed an instruction to drill a pair of holes in the top of the turret, but as luck would have it, I was able to get the drill in through the turret ring. Crisis averted. The holes are for the commander's gun sight, but we won't worry about that for now. Next, I take the turret front part and install one of the gun holdy bits. If you installed both of these at this point, it would be hard, if not impossible, to get the gun mount on, so don't do that. Speaking of the gun mount, I add the polycaps to the pins on either side. Then I press that part into the holder, making sure the machine gun is on the right side, which in this case is the tank's left side. I then install the other gun holdy part, using plenty of glue and pressure to make sure everything lines up nicely and stays there. The main gun comes next because why not? There is keying here which should help get the positioning right, at least in regards to the position of the muzzle brake. There's a bit of play to it though, so you might have to nudge it side to side and up and down so that it looks nice and straight. I then did a bit more drilling because, if I didn't, there wouldn't be a mounting hole for the searchlight. I then install the turret sides. This is pretty easy. There's a guide tab at the bottom of each plate, and with plenty of glue and a bit of pressure, they'll stay there without any issue. I kind of like the way this turret is done. The central core part makes it very easy to align the outer plates, and there's much less risk of a bad fit than if you had to line everything up without the central part. The turret front and gun assembly can then go into place, which is also, unsurprisingly, easy. I apply a bit of pressure to make sure there isn't any unwanted gaps, and the turret is now armed. And dangerous. Hatches come next, and both of these come as two parts, which makes modelling them open rather easy, though as you can see I've chosen not to do that. Both hatches are easy to install, though you may need to do a bit of nudging to get them to sit properly in place. I then glue the air vent cover into its place inside the little circle towards the front of the turret. Easy. Next, I assemble the searchlight. This consists of two parts which are very easy to glue together. I put that aside to let the glue bond for a bit, and then I add these lifty doodads around the turret. There are 4 of these, one in each corner. They've got a D-shaped keying, so it's pretty hard to get these on wrong. I follow that with the searchlight I assembled about 7 years ago. This is easy enough to put on. Unsurprisingly, a little bit of nudging was needed to get it looking right. And by right, I mean straight ahead. An antenna mount comes next, to the left behind the commander's cupola. Nothing tricky here, really. Then I add the commander's vane sight. I think that's what this is called anyway. It's a way for the commander to know what the gun is pointing at, with a bit more accuracy than just guessing. It consists of a pair of small fiddly parts, but it's not too difficult to install. I'm not sure if all Cromwells had this, and it does seem to be an optional part, otherwise the holes for mounting it wouldn't need to be drilled out. The final detail is a pair of vision device covers. These are just as easy to install as those found on the hull, and that's the turret completed and ready to join the hull. This is achieved with the simple locking tab mechanism that you find on pretty much all of the Tamiya tanks in this scale, and many others. That's the Tamiya 1/48th scale Cromwell Mark IV completed. I am, for the most part, pretty happy with how this has turned out. The areas I had issues with were the rear mudguard parts. They don't look horrendous, but they're not great either, but I suppose I can deal with it. There's also the gap at the rear below that grille part. I don't think that's meant to be there. From most angles though, it's not particularly visible, and it shouldn't be too hard to fix anyway. I think, on the whole, those are pretty minor complaints, and it's a pretty decent model. I'm a fan of Cromwells in general, and I think they look pretty interesting, so it's no surprise that I like this. I'm not planning on painting this kit in the near future, but I do think when I eventually get around to it, it's going to end up looking pretty good. There's a good amount of detail and parts that will catch paint and weathering, and it should end up looking rather interesting. And even in its unpainted state, it's not bad to look at. I think the detail on this thing is pretty good. I'm sure there's some little bits of detail omitted in order to make the model practical to mould, there usually is. It's just a reality of models, and it would be very difficult and expensive to make something this small an absolutely perfect replica, which is probably just stating the obvious to most of you. Maybe I'm starting to waffle there. Anyway, I think, other than a couple of issues, Tamiya has done a very good job with this kit. It wasn't too difficult to build. I mean, Tamiya kits like this, while being pretty good quality, are not usually especially challenging, and I would consider them to be fairly beginner-friendly, largely owing to how neatly moulded the parts are. Because of that, there are rarely fitting issues. The 2 I encountered in this kit are rare, at least in my experience. I put this Cromwell together in 2 streams, which is about right for a kit like this. I would say if you're not streaming and making video and being distracted while you build it, this could be a nice casual single afternoon project. Speaking of streaming, if you would like to hang out with myself and the cool folks in chat while I put together models like this one, head on over to my Twitch channel and give me a follow. There's a link in the description. I've got a lot of cool stuff coming up, and if you want to see these things before they become YouTube videos, that would be the place to go. If you have any questions or comments, it would be great to see those in the comments section below. If you've built one of these or any other cool models and you would like to share, why not drop by our Discord community and show some pictures? We would love to see what you've done. And if you've not already, why not subscribe, follow, ring the bell, become a patron, or maybe just come say hi on Discord or Twitch when I'm live. Links to all of my things are in the description below, and, as always, I shall return soon. So, until then, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.